The message from Tehran landed with a sharp edge and a clear target: American wallets. On April 12th, Iran's Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf issued a warning that appeared aimed less at Washington's war planners than at drivers pulling up to gas pumps across the United States. The message, carried by Iranian state media, was blunt. Americans should get comfortable with today's gasoline prices because the pain could get worse if the confrontation keeps widening. It came as the White House moved toward a major escalation of pressure on Iran at sea. President Donald Trump said a U.S. naval blockade was about to begin, describing it as the next step after high-stakes talks failed to produce a breakthrough. The blockade, U.S. officials said, is designed to squeeze Iran's ability to ship oil and move goods through its ports without formally shutting down the Strait of Hormuz for everyone. Even before the blockade start time, the shockwaves were already moving through energy, markets, and into the lives of ordinary consumers. In the United States, the average price of regular gasoline was reported at about $4.125 per gallon on April 12th, according to widely circulated figures attributed to AAA. Analysts and consumers alike were watching a market that has become extremely sensitive to every new development, especially any hint that shipping through the Persian Gulf could be disrupted further. What makes this moment especially volatile is geography. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow maritime corridor connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean, and it is one of the most important energy choke points on Earth. The United States and its partners have long viewed the strait as vital to global trade and oil flows. Iran, sitting on its northern shore, have repeatedly signaled it can pressure or threaten transit when it feels cornered. Now, with open conflict stretching into its second month and diplomacy appearing stalled, both sides are acting as though time is no longer on their side. Ghalibaf's warning framed the conflict through the lens of economic blowback. His timing, just as the United States prepared to tighten maritime controls, was a reminder of the leverage Iran believes it still holds, even under heavy military and economic stress. From Washington's perspective, the blockade is being presented as a way to cut off Iranian revenue and constrain its capacity to fund military operations. The Trump administration argues that limiting Iranian exports, especially crude oil, will weaken Iran's staying power and push it toward concessions. But the same pressure that could choke Iran's economy can also ricochet through the global energy system, raising costs far from the battlefield. That is the risk hanging over consumers in the U.S., Europe, and Asia. That energy prices won't just rise temporarily on headlines, but spike and stay elevated if shipping disruptions deepen. The president has been publicly emphatic about the timeline and the intent. Speaking as the blockade approached, Trump described a coordinated international effort to stop Iran from selling oil. He said, Trump said, at 10 o'clock tomorrow, we have a blockade going into effect. That'll be 10 o'clock tomorrow. He also claimed other countries were aligning with the U.S. approach, adding, Trump said other nations are working so that Iran will not be able to sell oil, and that will be very effective. The administration's position is that this is a controlled escalation, not an indiscriminate attempt to halt all shipping through the region. U.S. officials have indicated that transit through the Strait of Hormuz to non-Iranian ports would be allowed, while maritime traffic to and from Iranian ports would face restrictions. Mariners in the region have been urged to track official advisories and maintain communication with U.S. naval forces while moving through contested blockade and regional shipping crisis sea, and be dangerously thin when tension is already high and multiple armed actors are operating in close proximity. Iran, for its part, has signaled it is already shaping maritime realities on its own terms. Iranian forces have reportedly restricted passage through the Strait of Hormuz with selective allowances. The message from Iran's Revolutionary Guards Navy has been that adversaries should not expect a return to the earlier status quo, even if the conflict's intensity shifts. That dynamic, American restrictions around Iranian ports, Iranian pressure inside the strait, creates a climate where shipping companies and insurers may decide the route is simply not worth the risk. And when tankers hesitate, the market reacts quickly. Oil prices surged after Washington announced the blockade plan, with traders treating it as a major new threat to stability in supply chains. The price move reflected fear that more shipping would stall, fear of retaliation, and fear that an already fragile flow of crude could tighten further. For American drivers, the consequence is straightforward. Higher crude prices and disrupted supply expectations tend to translate into higher prices at the pump, often with a lag, but sometimes rapidly, especially when refiners and distributors start building in risk premiums. In recent weeks, consumers have already watched fuel costs climb dramatically compared with pre-war levels, according to reports cited in the same coverage. That has fueled fresh anxiety about inflation pressure, household budgets, and the broader economic outlook. Meanwhile, the president has been projecting confidence that the U.S. can absorb any shock He argued that domestic oil strength puts the country in a better position to endure turbulence, leaning heavily on the idea that higher production can offset overseas disruption. He also portrayed Iran as severely degraded militarily in comments that were both sweeping and absolute. Trump describes what he claimed had happened to Iran's Navy and strike capabilities. He said Trump said their military is destroyed. He escalated that claim further, adding Trump said their whole Navy is underwater. Then he repeated the point as if to close the argument. Trump said their Navy's gone. Those claims are central to how the administration is selling the next phase of the operation. If Iran's military is already battered, the theory goes Iran will have fewer options to respond effectively to a maritime squeeze. But Iran's warning about gasoline prices suggests Tehran believes it retains asymmetric leverage even if parts of its conventional force have suffered. Iran does not need to match the U.S. ship for ship to create disruption. It only needs to make the region feel unsafe enough that the world's energy system starts to wobble. That is the logic behind the chilling tone of the message aimed at Americans. Iran's leadership understands the political sensitivity of gasoline prices inside the United States, and it understands how quickly public sentiment can shift when consumers feel punished for decisions made far away. For weeks, the diplomatic track has been held up as the alternative to further escalation. But the peace talks that recently took place in Islamabad ended without the deal that negotiators needed, and both sides emerged sounding less conciliatory. The White House has framed Iran as the party refusing to take the off-ramp. Trump made clear he was not interested in appearing desperate for negotiations. In one of his starkest lines, he said, Trump said, I don't care if they come back or not. He reinforced the hard edge of that posture, suggesting the U.S. could proceed regardless of whether Iran returns to talks. He also repeated a core promise that has defined U.S. policy toward Iran for years, preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. He stated it as a certainty, leaving no room for ambiguity. Asterisk Trump said Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. As to this, in the administration's view, is not simply a conventional military confrontation or a regional power struggle. It is being framed as a campaign to permanently prevent Iran from reaching a strategic threshold. But even if the goal is clear, the pathway is not. Blockades by nature test international norms, raise questions of enforcement, and invite the possibility of escalation if vessels are intercepted, diverted, or attacked. And every added layer of tension becomes another variable in a global economy that still runs heavily on oil. In the background of the blockade decision is the question many are now asking: who is winning the advantage? After a month of war and collapsing diplomacy, the conflict has reached a phase where neither side is talking like a party preparing to compromise. The U.S. is escalating maritime pressure. Iran is highlighting the consequences and signaling endurance. The world's energy markets are reacting, and consumers are feeling the impact. At the same time, the president has widened his rhetorical battlefield at home and abroad. In remarks that spilled beyond the Iran conflict, Trump criticized Pope Leo XIV, the first American-born pontiff, tying cultural grievances and domestic crime politics into a moment of international crisis. He said, asterisk, Trump said, I don't like it. I'm not a big fan of Pope Leo. Then he sharpened the criticism into a political label, saying Trump said he's a very liberal person. The attack on the Pope underscored how the administration's messaging has merged multiple fronts: war strategy, energy policy, domestic politics, and culture war grievances into a single narrative of confrontation. But for many Americans, the most immediate reality is not in rhetoric. It is in price, digits glowing at gas stations, and in the uncertainty of what comes next. U.S. officials have described the blockade as beginning on April 13th at 10 a.m., applying to maritime traffic entering or leaving Iranian ports and coastal areas along Iran's shoreline, and spanning routes across the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. Even with assurances that transit to non-Iranian ports through the Strait of Hormuz would continue, the region is operating under heightened risk, and risk itself carries a price. If shipping remains stalled or constrained, if insurers raise premiums, if tankers reroute, if markets begin to expect longer disruption, consumers could face another wave of increases at the pump in transport costs and eventually in prices that ripple through the wider economy. Iran's message was designed to make that possibility feel personal. The White House's blockade plan was designed to make Iran's export economy feel the squeeze. Between those two forces sits a global energy system that reacts fast and punishes hesitation. As the blockade takes effect and both sides test each other's resolve, the next question is not only whether the sure campaign changes Iran's calculus, it is whether Americans and the rest of the world are about to learn what it costs when the world's most critical